Welcome to the Australian Friends of Palestine 2025 Edward Say Memorial Lecture, our 20th. I'm Mary Kostakidis and I'm honoured to be with you this evening as AFOPA's chairperson. We begin this year's Year Samar with Welcome to Country. I'd like to introduce Uncle Moogy to you. Major Moogy Sumner is an Narrandjeri Ghana elder, a cultural performer and artist, as well as the cultural and artistic director of Takijeri Dance Group. He's a world-renowned performer and cultural ambassador of Narrandjeri arts, crafts, martial arts and traditional culture. In 2014, Major Sumner was appointed a member of the Order of Australia for decades of service to Indigenous community and cultural education. Uncle Moogy is also a standing member of the World Archaeological Congress, the World Council of Elders, and was recently elected to the South Australian First Nations Voice Department. Please join me in welcoming Uncle Moogy.
What I'd like to do before we have the start is welcome our ancestors here to be with us. My ancestors, your ancestors, wherever you come from. Invite their spirit to be here, to sit down next to you, to be a part of this gathering, to help us, to work out a way to help ourselves. Welcome to When I said I invited the ancestors from the 4 directions to come here and sit down in the land of the Ghana people, the land of my mother. The song was to welcome you and your ancestors here to this land. The words at the end was asking them to take away any negative energy that attaches itself to us as we travel across the land. Ask them to take that away. So as we have a good night here tonight, we enjoy each other's company, but mainly look after each other. On behalf of my mother's people, the Ghana people, I welcome you and your ancestors here to this land. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you, Uncle Moogy. It's a privilege to have you with us tonight. Thank you. I'd now like to introduce Samar Sammour. Samar is a Palestinian woman who's been based in Adelaide for the last 7 years. She's a dedicated healthcare worker and a proud mum of 2 boys. Samar has been a regular speaker at our now over 2 years of Palestine Solidarity rallies, amplifying the Palestinian cause with clarity and conviction. She is also a leading member of Healthcare Workers for Palestine, a grassroots initiative that mobilises health professionals in visible solidarity with the Palestinian struggle for liberation in their homeland. She is also the founder and facilitator of Tartaries at Table, a wonderful workshop that Samar runs, and it's about traditional Palestinian embroidery workshops that serve as both a form of cultural preservation and a space for education, fundraising and collective healing among Palestinians and allies. Through her words and work, Samar weaves together heritage, resistance and community. We're absolutely delighted that Samar is taking part in tonight's BSML. Please welcome her.
Thank you, Krista, and thank you, Uncle, for your generous welcome. I'd like to acknowledge the Ghana people, the traditional custodians of the land we're meeting on today. We're very privileged to be here and work together with a spirit of respect and reconciliation. Thank you all for being here tonight. It's an honor to stand before you in solidarity, in hope, and in shared purpose. Can you hear me at the back? Yeah. My name is Samar. I'm a second-generation diaspora Palestinian. Both of my parents were born in 1948 in Palestine. I, however, was born in the Gulf and spent my formative years in Aotearoa, New Zealand. But my heart has always carried the land, the people, and the story of Palestine. For me, advocacy is not an abstract choice. It's woven into my very identity. As most Palestinians living in diaspora, we carry with us a paradox. We are both present and absent. We cultivate these new lives in places far from home, we assimilate, we sometimes conform, while our minds and our hearts remain tethered to a homeland under siege, a people under occupation, and more recently what feels like the most horrific phase of the decades-long ethnic cleansing of our people. This duality is often painful. We are burdened to teach. We're burdened to justify in rooms that don't want to listen, and to represent, even when our souls are exhausted. Yet diaspora also gives us a unique vantage perspective. From afar, we bear witness in different ways. We translate the stories and we build bridges, we testify. In my life here in Tanzania, I try to do precisely that, whether it's teaching the history in intimate Khatris workshops to an audience that were blissfully unaware, or screaming into a megaphone at the Parliament steps and down the streets. Grief is our mother tongue, but so is resistance. To be a Palestinian woman is to exist in defiance of erasure. Even in exile, we are unyielding proof that they have not succeeded and will not succeed. You see, for me, there's a very fundamental difference between claiming ownership of land and belonging to that land. The colonizer speaks of possession, as if land can be owned, promised, divided, taken. But for Palestinians, and if you were to hear any of our poetry, our folk songs, our stories of our grandparents, for us the land is not a commodity, and that's the difference. It's an extension of self, of memory, of history. It's something that we belong to, not something we own. And this exact distinction is at the heart of our struggle, and of all Indigenous struggles, including the resistance of First Nations people here on this very land. Their struggle echoes in us, and we know that no one is free until we're all free. Tonight we're so honored to hear from Mr. Hedges, whose work I've admired as it challenges complacency, pierces illusions, and pulls us to moral courage. To me personally, your warnings have resonated deeply with what it means to be a Palestinian living in exile. But before we hear from Mr. Hedges, I'd like to take a moment to reflect on the importance of courageous journalism, especially in times when truth is contested and speaking out carries personal risk. Mary Kostakidis has spent decades at the forefront of public broadcasting in Australia as the face of SBS World News for over 20 years. She became a trusted figure in households across the country. But Mary's work goes far beyond news presentation. She has been a staunch advocate for press freedom, transparency, and the public's right to know. Her deep interest in geopolitics, national security, and foreign policy has shaped her commentary. She has also contributed so meaningfully to the national conversation on human rights, serving on the federal government's National Human Rights Consultation Committee, which recommended the establishment of a Human Rights Act. More recently, amid the ongoing live-stream genocide in Gaza, Mary has continued to speak out, using her platform to hold power to account. For this, she has been targeted by legal action, initiated under the hate speech provisions by the CEO of the Zionist Federation of Australia. In response to her public statements about Israeli war crimes. It is in this climate, where truth-telling is met with intimidation, that Mary's voice is more vital than ever. Please join me in very warmly welcoming Mrs. Mary Kostakidis.
What an honour it is today to hear from a Palestinian woman. And what an honour it is for me to introduce a journalist as distinguished as Chris Hedges, who has made a vital contribution to our understanding of Israel-Palestine relations through a lens other than the lens used by the Western mainstream media, which has successfully dehumanised Palestinian people over decades. We live in unprecedented times. Never before have a people filmed and transmitted their own genocide to the world daily. Nor have we before witnessed genocidaires announcing their plans, boasting about their achievements, and mocking their victims daily. Nor have we seen before such widespread attempts in the West to suppress free speech in order to regain control of the narrative. And amid this shocking realisation that a new standard has been set for the level of brutality that leaders will tolerate, citizens around the world have come together, united in their rejection of apocalyptic violence, of genocide, of ethnic cleansing, and of erasure, and in the common cause of peace with justice, freedom, equality, and dignity for all, and in protest at their leaders' failure to bring an end to the obscene slaughter. We've grappled with profound moral injury, augmented by their inaction. I'd like to pay tribute to the Australian Friends of Palestine Association because it's among the most effective organisations whose work has enabled people to rally and send a strong message to our political leaders. At the core of Friends of Palestine is this Edward Said Memorial Lecture. It is the centrepiece of the organisation. And it held its first Edward Said Memorial Lecture in 2005 with the distinguished writer and journalist Robert Fisk. Each year it's an opportunity to bring to Australia leading thinkers and practitioners in honour of Palestinian American public intellectual, academic, writer and political activist Edward Said. And again, the the organisation returns to acknowledging courage and truth in journalism. Since Robert Fisk, we've had John Pilger and Gideon Levy, and today we have Chris Hedges. And in between, we've had many illustrious scholars, activists, academics, writers, among them Francesca Albanese, Ilan Pape, Noam Chomsky, Hanan Ashrawi, Noura Erakat. As many of you here know, Saeed was born in Jerusalem to Palestinian Christian parents. He attended 2 Ivy League universities and became a tenured professor at a third. His field was literature, that rich source from which we learn so much about our fellow human beings, how they see themselves and how they see other people. Saeed co-founded the discipline of post-colonial studies, but among other things, he was a gifted pianist, and along with Daniel Barenboim, co-founded the West Eastern Divan Orchestra, and the Conservatory of Music in Ramallah is named in Saeed's honour. It's extraordinary that a world-class Australian pianist is to pay with his career, it seems, for introducing a piece of music composed for the almost 300 now journalists in Gaza who have been killed by Israel. Jason Gillum is the only classical musician with the courage to raise the unmentionables on an Australian stage. Since the beginning of the war between Russia and Ukraine, I've twice attended concerts where pianists condemned Vladimir Putin with no repercussion whatsoever. Political comment on our stages, it seems, is evidently fine if it aligns with the perspective of a certain colour. Israel, it seems, must always be treated with reverence, and those who refuse are taught a lesson and made an example of. Days before legal action was launched against me, our former Attorney General, Mark Dreyfus, announced that if someone is holding Israel to a standard different to that of other countries, then yes, they are anti-Semitic, anti-Semites. And I didn't realise at the time how true what he was saying is, because Arabs are Semites, and we have held Israel to a different standard for decades. Today we're privileged to hear from a journalist who has long called out such double standards. Chris Hedges is a Pulitzer Prize-winning film correspondent of the New York Times. He's covered wars and conflicts in El Salvador, Guatemala, Nicaragua, Bosnia and Kosovo. Chris spent 7 years in the Middle East, much of that time in Gaza, and speaks Arabic. He's written 16 books, including several New York Times bestsellers, his latest, The Genocide Foretold. Chris, too, has taught at Saeed's alma mater, Columbia, and Princeton, among other universities. And if you're not watching Chris Hedges' report, I'm sure all of you are, and reading his Substack, we are not missing out on the illuminating discussions he conducts, not only with the depth of knowledge and clarity, but with the wisdom that comes with an unwavering moral compass. Chris's visit to Australia includes speaking at public events in Sydney and Melbourne and at universities in all 3 cities over a jam-packed 6 days. Now, in an event I know many people were looking forward to, he was to speak at the National Press Club in Canberra. And this would have been a great opportunity for the nation to hear from a journalist of Chris's calibre. importantly, it would have provided an opportunity for journalists to hear a critique of media coverage of the Middle East and of the Western media's response to Gaza's journalists and their targeted slaughter. However, the event was cancelled after the club was informed of the thrust of Chris's speech. It's deeply disappointing that our National Press Club considers the topic not significant enough or out of its comfort zone. The fourth estate, charged with holding power to account, won't broker self-scrutiny. If we fail to interrogate our own biases, we're deluded in believing that we're objective in our craft. The Press Club was the most appropriate place to have this conversation, but that address will be delivered on Monday night in Sydney. Now, following Chris's talk today, we'll have a short discussion, as long as time permits, and following that, he'll be signing books in the foyer. So please put your hands together and join me in welcoming Chris Hedges to Adelaide to deliver the 2025 Edward Said Memorial Lecture.
Thank you for having me. It's a great honor to be here and all the hard work that Australian Friends of Palestine and Krista did to get me here and rearranging the schedule at the last minute. I appreciate all your work. The Gaza, the one that existed on the morning of October 7th, is gone. Decimated by months of saturation bombing, shelling, bulldozing, and controlled demolitions. All that was familiar when I worked in Gaza has vanished, transformed into an apocalyptic landscape of shattered concrete and rubble. The New York Times office in the center of Gaza City, the Marna boarding house on Ahmed Abed El Aziz Street, where after a day's work, I would drink tea with Margaret Nasser, the elderly woman who owned it, a refugee from Safad in northern Galilee. On my last visit to the Marna house, I forgot to return the room key. Number 12 was attached to a large plastic oval with the words, Marna House, Gaza. The key sits on my desk. Friends and colleagues, with few exceptions, are in exile, dead, or in most cases have disappeared, no doubt buried under the mountains of debris. The daily rituals of life in Gaza are no longer possible. I used to leave my shoes on a rack by the front door of the great Omari Mosque, the largest and oldest mosque in Gaza, in the Daraj quarter of the old city. The white stone walls had pointed arches and a tall octagonal minaret encircled by a carved wooden balcony that was crowned with a crescent. The mosque was built on the foundations of ancient temples to Philistine and Roman deities, as well as a Byzantine church. I washed my hands, face, and feet at the common water taps, carrying out the ritual purification before prayers known as wada. Inside the hushed interior with its blue carpeted floor, the cacophony, noise, dust, fumes, and frenetic pace of Gaza melted away. The mosque was destroyed on December 8, 2023 by an Israeli airstrike. The razing of Gaza is not only a crime against the Palestinian people, it is a crime against our cultural at historical heritage, an assault on memory. We cannot understand the present, especially when reporting on Palestinians and Israelis, if we do not understand the past. There is no shortage of failed peace plans in occupied Palestine, all of them incorporating detailed phases and timelines going back to the presidency of Jimmy Carter. They end the same way. Israel gets what it wants initially in the latest case, the release of the remaining Israeli hostages and the bodies of those who are deceased, while it ignores and violates every other phase until it resumes its attacks on the Palestinian people. It is a sadistic game, a merry-go-round of death. This ceasefire, like those of the past, is a commercial break, a moment when the condemned man or woman is allowed to smoke a cigarette before being gunned down in a fusillade of bullets. The genocide will continue. I do not know how soon. Let's hope the mass slaughter is delayed for at least a few weeks. But a pause in the genocide is the best we can anticipate. Israel is on the cusp of emptying Gaza, which has been all but obliterated under 2 years of relentless bombing. And it is not about to be stopped. This is the culmination of the Zionist dream. The United States, which has given Israel a staggering $22 billion in military aid since October 7th, will not shut down this pipeline, the only tool that might halt the genocide. Israel, as it always does, will blame Hamas and the Palestinians for failing to abide by the agreement, most probably a refusal, true or not, to disarm, as the proposal demands. Washington condemning Hamas's supposed violation will give Israel the green light to continue its genocide to create Trump's fantasy of a Gazan Riviera and special economic zone with its quote-unquote voluntary relocation of Palestinians in exchange for digital tokens. Of the myriads of peace plans over the decades, the current one is the least serious. Aside from a demand that Hamas release the hostages within 72 hours after the ceasefire begins, it lacks utterly specifics and imposed timetables. And it is filled with caveats that allow Israel to abrogate the agreement, which Israel has done almost immediately by its refusing to open the border crossing at Rafah, killing almost 30 Palestinians since the ceasefire went into effect, and cutting in half the agreed-upon aid trucks to 300 a day, they argue, because the bodies of the remaining hostages have not been returned. And that is the point. It is not designed to be a viable path to peace, which most Israelis understand. Israel's largest circulation newspaper, Israel Hayom, established by the late casino magnate Sheldon Adelson to serve as a mouthpiece for Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and champion Messianic Zionism, instructed its readers not to be concerned about the Trump plan because it is, and I quote, only rhetoric. Israel, in one example from the proposal, will, quote, not return to areas that have been withdrawn from as long as Hamas fully implements the agreement. Who decides if Hamas has fully implemented the agreement? Israel. Does anyone believe in Israel's good faith? Can Israel be trusted as an objective arbiter of the agreement? If Hamas, demonized as a terrorist group, objects, who will listen? How is it possible that a peace proposal ignores the International Court of Justice's July 2024 advisory opinion, which reiterated that Israel's occupation is illegal and must end. How can it fail to mention the Palestinians' right to self-determination? Why are Palestinians who have a right under international law to armed struggle against an occupying power expected to disarm, like Israel, which perpetrates the genocide and is an illegal occupying force, is not? By what authority can the U.S. establish a temporary transitional government? This is Trump and the odious Tony Blair's so-called War of Peace, sidelining the Palestinian right to self-determination. Who gave the United States the authority to send to Gaza an international stabilization force, a thinly veiled term for foreign occupation? How are Palestinians supposed to reconcile themselves to the acceptance of an Israeli quote-unquote security barrier on Gaza's borders, confirmation that the occupation will continue? How can any proposal ignore the slow-motion genocide and annexation of the West Bank? Why is Israel, which has destroyed Gaza, not required to pay reparations? What are Palestinians supposed to make of the demand in the proposal for a quote-unquote de-radicalized Gazan population? How is this expected to be accomplished? Re-education camps? Wholesale censorship, the rewriting of school curriculum, arresting offending imams in the mosques? And what about addressing the incendiary rhetoric routinely employed by Israeli leaders who describe Palestinians as human animals and their children as little snakes? All of Gaza and every child in Gaza should starve to death. Rabbi Ronen Shalom, Israel's version of the Reverend Samuel Marsden, bellowed. I don't have mercy for those who in a few years will grow up and won't have mercy for us. Only a stupid fifth column, a hater of Israel, has mercy for future terrorists, even though today they are still young and hungry. I hope, may they starve to death, and if anyone has a problem with what I've said, that's their problem. Israel's violation of peace agreements have long historical precedents. The Camp David Accords, signed in 1978 by Egyptian President Anwar Sadat and Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin, without the participation of the Palestine Liberation Organization, led to the 1979 Egypt-Israel Peace Treaty, which normalized diplomatic relations between Israel and Egypt. Subsequent phases of the Camp David Accords, which included a promise by Israel to resolve the Palestinian question, along with Jordan and Egypt, permit Palestinian self-governance in the West Bank and Gaza within 5 years, and end the building of Israeli colonies in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, were never implemented. The 1993 Oslo Accords, which I covered, recognized the PLO as the legitimate representatives of the Palestinian people. Yet what ensued was the disempowerment of the PLO and its transformation into a colonial police force. Oslo II, signed in 1995, detailed the process towards peace and a Palestinian state, but it too was stillborn. It stipulated that It stipulated that any discussion of illegal Jewish settlements were to be delayed until final status talks. By then, Israeli military withdrawals from the occupied West Bank were scheduled to have been completed. Governing authority was poised to be transferred from Israel to the supposedly temporary Palestinian Authority. Instead, the West Bank was carved up into areas A, B, and C. The Palestinian Authority had limited authority in areas A and B, while Israel controlled all of Area C, over 60% of the West Bank, and they now control 80% of the West Bank. the right of Palestinian refugees to return to the historic lands that Jewish colonists seized from them in 1948 when Israel was created, a right enshrined in international law, was given up by the PLO leader Yasser Arafat. This instantly alienated many Palestinians, especially those in Gaza, where 75% are refugees or descendants of refugees. As a consequence, many Palestinians abandoned the PLO in favor of Hamas. Edward Said, who, like Robert Fisk, was a close friend, called the Oslo Accords, quote, an instrument of Palestinian surrender, a Palestinian Versailles, and he lambasted Arafat as the Pétain of the Palestinians. The scheduled Israeli military withdrawals under Oslo never took place. There were around 250,000 Jewish colonists in the West Bank when the Oslo Agreement was signed. Their numbers today have increased to over 700,000. The journalist Robert Fisk called Oslo, quote, a sham, a lie, a trick to entangle Arafat and the PLO into abandonment of all that they had sought and struggled for over a quarter of a century, a method of creating false hope in order to emasculate the aspiration of statehood. Israel unilaterally broke the last 2-month-long ceasefire on March 18th of this year when it launched surprise airstrikes on Gaza. Netanyahu's office claimed that the resumption of the military campaign was in response to Hamas's refusal to release hostages, its rejection of proposals to extend the ceasefire, and its efforts to rearm. Israel killed more than 400 people in the initial overnight assault and injured over 500, slaughtering and wounding people, including children, as they slept. The attack scuttled the second stage of the agreement, which would have seen Hamas release the remaining living male hostages, both civilians and soldiers, for an exchange of Palestinian prisoners and the establishment of a permanent ceasefire, along with the eventual lifting of the Israeli blockade of Gaza. Israel has carried out murderous assaults on Gaza for decades, cynically calling the bombardment mowing the lawn. No peace accord or ceasefire agreement has ever gotten in the way, and this one will be no exception. This bloody saga is not over. Israel's goals remain unchanged: the dispossession and erasure of Palestinians from their land. The only peace Israel intends to offer the Palestinians is the peace of the grave. History is a mortal threat to the Zionist project. It exposes the violent imposition of a European colony in the Arab world. It reveals the ruthless campaign to de-Arabize an Arab country. It underscores the inherent racism towards Arabs, their culture, and their traditions. It challenges the myth that, as the former Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak said, Zionists created a villa in the middle of a jungle. It mocks the lie that Palestine is exclusively a Jewish homeland. It recalls centuries of Palestinian presence, and it highlights the alien culture of Zionism implanted on stolen land. When I covered the genocide in Bosnia, the Serbs, like the Israelis, blew up mosques, carted away the remains, and forbade anyone to speak of the structures they had razed. The goal in Gaza is the same: to wipe out the past and replace it with myth, to mask Israeli crimes, including genocide. The campaign of erasure allows Israelis to pretend the inherent violence that lies at the heart of the Zionist project, going back to the dispossession of Palestinian land in the 1920s and the larger campaigns of ethnic cleansing of Palestinians in 1948 and 1967 does not exist. This denial of historical truth and historical identity also permits Israelis to wallow in eternal victimhood. It sustains a morally blind nostalgia for an invented past. If Israelis confront these lies, it threatens an existential crisis. It forces them to rethink who they are, and most prefer the comfort of illusion. The desire to believe is more powerful than the desire to see. As long as truth is hidden, as long as those who seek truth are silenced, it is impossible for any society to regenerate and reform itself. It becomes calcified. Its lies and dissimulation must be constantly renewed. And truth is dangerous. Once it is established, it is indestructible. The Trump administration is in lockstep with Israel. It too seeks to prioritize myth over reality. It too silences those who challenge the lies of the past and the lies of the present. This genocide is the culmination of an historical process that is not an isolated act. The genocide is the predictable denouement of Israel's settler colonial project. It is coded within the DNA of the Israeli apartheid state. It is where Israel had to end up. Every horrifying act of Israel's genocide has been telegraphed in advance, and it has been for decades. The dispossession of Palestinians of their land is the beating heart of Israel's settler colonialism. This dispossession has had, as I mentioned, dramatic historical moments, 1948, 1967, when huge parts of historic Palestine were seized and hundreds of thousands ethnically cleansed. But dispossession has also occurred in increments. The slow motion theft of land and steady ethnic cleansing in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem. But in scale, we have not seen an assault on the Palestinians of this magnitude. Although we haven't seen an assault of this magnitude, all these measures, the killing of civilians, the ethnic cleansing, arbitrary detention, widespread torture, disappearances, closures, imposed on Palestinian towns and villages, house demolitions, revoking residence permits, deportation, destruction of the infrastructure that maintains civil society, military occupation, dehumanizing language, the theft of natural resources, especially aquifers, have long defined Israel's campaign to eradicate Palestinians. The incursion on October 7th into Israel by Hamas and other resistance groups, which left roughly 1,200 Israelis, tourists, migrant workers dead, and saw about 240 people taken hostage, gave Israel the pretext for what it has long craved, the cover to implement its own version of the final solution. October 7th marked the dividing line between an Israeli policy that advocated the brutalization and subjugation of the Palestinians and a policy that calls for their extermination and removal from historic Palestine. Israel's weaponization of starvation is how genocides always end. I covered the insidious effects of orchestrated starvation in the Guatemalan highlands during the genocidal campaign of General Ephraim Rios Montt. The famine in southern Sudan that left 250,000 dead. I walked past the frail and skeletal corpses of families lining the roadsides. And later during the war in Bosnia, when the Serbs blocked food and aid to Srebrenica and Gorazde. Starvation was weaponized by the Ottoman Empire to decimate the Armenians. It was used to kill millions of Ukrainians in 1932 and 1933. It was employed by the Nazis against the Jews in the ghettos in World War II. German soldiers used food as Israel does, like bait. They offered 3 kilos of bread and 1 kilogram of marmalade to lure desperate families in the Warsaw Ghetto onto the transports to the death camps. There were were times when hundreds of people had to wait in line for several days to be deported, Marek Edelman writes in The Ghetto Fights. The number of people anxious to obtain the 3 kilograms of bread was such that the transports now leaving twice daily with 12,000 people could not accommodate them all. And the crowds became unruly as in Gaza. The German troops fired deadly volleys that ripped through the emaciated husks of women, children, and the elderly. This tactic is as old as warfare itself. Israel methodically set out from the beginning of the genocide to destroy sources of food, bombing bakeries, and blocking food shipments into Gaza, something it has accelerated since March when it severed nearly all food supplies. It targeted the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine refugees in the Near East, on which most Palestinians depended for food for destruction, accusing its employees without providing evidence of being involved in the attacks of October 7th. This accusation was used to give funders, such as the United States, which provided $422 million to the agency in 2023, the excuse to hold financial support. Israel then banned UNRWA. The blockade of food and humanitarian aid imposed on Gaza reduced Palestinians to abject dependence. To eat, they were forced to crawl to their killers in bed. Humiliated, terrified, desperate for a few scraps of food, they were stripped of dignity, autonomy, and agency, and this was by design. A nightmarish journey to one of the 4 aid hubs set up by the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation was never designed to meet the needs of the Palestinians, who once relied on 400 UN aid distribution sites, but to lure them from northern Gaza to the south. Palestinians were herded like livestock into narrow metal chutes at distribution points overseen by heavily armed mercenaries. They received, if they were one of the fortunate few, a small box of food, but most received nothing. And when crowds became unruly in the chaotic scramble, the Israelis and mercenaries gunned them down, killing 1,700 and injuring thousands more. But this genocide marks a break from the past. It marks the exposure of Israeli lies. The lie of the two-state solution, the lie that Israel respects the laws of war to protect civilians, the lie that Israel bombs hospitals and schools only because they are used as staging areas by Hamas, the lie that Hamas uses civilians as human shields when Israel routinely forces captive Palestinians dressed in Israeli army uniforms with their hands bound to enter potentially booby-trapped tunnels and buildings ahead of Israeli troops. The lie that Hamas or Palestine Islamic Jihad are responsible, the charge often being errant Palestinian rockets, for the destruction of hospitals, UN buildings, or mass casualties. The lie that humanitarian aid to Gaza is blocked because Hamas is hijacking the trucks or smuggling weapons and war material. The lie that Israeli babies are beheaded or Palestinians carried out sexual assaults of Israeli women. The lie that 75% of the tens of thousands killed in Gaza were Hamas terrorists. The lie that Hamas, because it was allegedly rearming and recruiting new fighters, is always responsible for the breakdown of ceasefire agreements. Israel's naked, genocidal visage is exposed. The expansion of Greater Israel, which includes the seizing of Syrian territory in the Golan Heights, southern Lebanon, Gaza, and the occupied West Bank, where some 40,000 Palestinians have been driven from their homes since October 7th, and which I expect will soon be annexed by Israel, is being cemented into place. But the genocide in Gaza is only the start. The world is breaking down under the onslaught of the climate crisis, which is triggering mass migrations, failed states, and catastrophic wildfires, hurricanes, storms, flooding, and droughts. As global stability unravels, industrial violence, which is decimating the Palestinians, will become ubiquitous. Israel's annihilation of Gaza marks the death of a global order guided by internationally agreed upon laws and rules, ones often violated by the United States in its imperial wars in Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan, but one that was at least acknowledged as an ideal. The U.S. and its Western allies not only supply the weaponry to sustain the genocide, but obstruct the demand by most nations for an adherence to humanitarian law. They have carried out attacks against the only nation, Yemen, which has had the courage to try and halt the genocide. And the message this sends is clear. We have everything. If you try and take it away from us, we will kill you. The militarized drones, helicopter gunships, walls and barriers, checkpoints, coils of concertina wire, watchtowers, detention centers, deportations, brutality and torture, denial of entry visas, apartheid existence that comes with being undocumented, loss of individual rights, and electronic surveillance are as familiar to the desperate migrants along the Mexican border or attempting to enter Europe as they are to the Palestinians. Israel, which as Ronan Bergman notes in his book Rise and Kill First, has assassinated more people than any other country in the Western world, cynically employs the Nazi Holocaust to sanctify its hereditary victimhood and justify its settler colonial state, apartheid campaigns of mass slaughter, and Zionist version of Lebensraum. Primo Levi, who survived Auschwitz, saw the Shoah for this reason as, quote, an inexhaustible source of evil, which is perpetuated as hatred in the survivors and springs up in 1,000 ways against the very will of all, as a thirst for revenge, as moral breakdown, as negation, as weariness, as resignation. Genocide and mass extermination are not the exclusive domain of fascist Germany or even Israel. Ami César, in Discourse on Colonialism, writes that Hitler seemed exceptionally cruel only because he presided over the humiliation of the white man, applying to Europe the colonialist procedures which until then had been reserved exclusively for the Arabs of Africa, the coolies of India, and the Nez d'Afrique. The near annihilation of Tasmania's Aboriginal population, the German slaughter of the Herero and Amakwa, the Armenian genocide, the Bengal famine in 1943, then British Prime Minister Winston Churchill airily dismissed the deaths of 3 million Indians in the famine by calling them, quote, a beastly people with a beastly religion, along with the dropping of nuclear bombs on the civilian targets of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, illustrates something fundamental about Western civilization. The moral philosophers who make up the Western canon, Immanuel Kant, Voltaire, David Hume, John Stuart Mill, and John Locke, excluded enslaved and exploited people, indigenous peoples, colonized people, women of all races, and the criminalized from their moral calculus. In their eyes, European whiteness alone imparted modernity, moral virtue, judgment, and freedom. This racist definition of personhood played a central role in justifying colonialism, slavery, the genocide of Native Americans and First Nations people in Australia, as well as our own imperial projects and fetish for white supremacy. So when you hear that the Western canon is an imperative, ask yourself, for whom? In America, the poet Langston Hughes said, Negroes do not have to be told what fascism is in action, we know. Its theories of Nordic supremacy and economic suppression have long been realities to us. The Nazis, when they formulated the Nuremberg laws, modeled them on American Jim Crow-era segregation and discrimination laws. America's refusal to grant citizenship to Native Americans and Filipinos, although they lived in the U.S. and U.S. territories, was copied by the German fascists to strip citizenship from Jews. American anti-miscegenation laws, which criminalized interracial marriage, was the impetus to outlaw marriages between German Jews and Aryans. American jurisprudence classified anyone with 1% of black ancestry, the so-called one-drop rule, as black. The Nazis, ironically, showing more flexibility, classified anyone with 3 or more Jewish grandparents as Jewish. The millions of victims of colonial projects in countries such as Mexico, China, India, Australia, the Congo, and Vietnam, for this reason, are deaf to the fatuous claims by Jews that their victimhood is unique. For they also suffered Holocausts. These Holocausts remain minimized or unacknowledged by their Western perpetrators. The fact is, genocide is coded in the DNA of Western imperialism. Palestine has made this clear. The genocide in Gaza is the next stage in what the anthropologist Arjun Apadori calls a vast, worldwide Malthusian correction that is geared to preparing the world for the winners of globalization minus the inconvenient noise of its losers. Israel embodies the ethno-nationalist state the far-right dreams of creating for themselves, one that rejects political and cultural pluralism as well as legal, diplomatic, and ethical norms. Israel is admired by these proto-fascists because it has turned its back on humanitarian law to use indiscriminate lethal force to cleanse its society of those condemned as human contaminants. Israel is not an outlier. It expresses our darkest impulses, and I fear our future. I covered the birth of Jewish fascism in Israel. I reported on the extremist Mary Kostakidis, who was barred from running for office and whose Koch party was outlawed in 1994 and declared a terrorist organization by Israel and the United States. I attended political rallies held by Netanyahu, who received lavish funding from right-wing Americans, including AIPAC, when he ran against Rabin, who was negotiating a peace settlement with the Palestinians. Netanyahu's supporters chanted death to Rabin. They burned an effigy of Rabin dressed in a Nazi uniform, and I watched Netanyahu march in front of a mock funeral for Rabin. Rabin was assassinated on November 4th, 1995 by a Jewish fanatic. And Rabin's widow, Leah, blamed Netanyahu for her husband's murder. Netanyahu, who first became prime minister in 1996, has spent his political career nurturing these Jewish extremists, including Itamar Ben-Gvir, Bezalel Smotrich, Avigdor Lieberman, Gideon Saar, and Naftali Bennett. Netanyahu's father, Ben Zion, worked as an assistant to the Zionist pioneer Vladimir Jabotinsky, who Benito Mussolini referred to, I'm quoting, as a good fascist, was a leader in the Herut party that called on the Jewish state to seize all the land of historic Palestine. Many of those who formed the Herut party carried out terrorist attacks during the 1948 war that established the State of Israel. Albert Einstein, Hannah Arendt, Sidney Hook, and other Jewish intellectuals described the Herut party in a statement published in the New York Times as, quote, a political party closely akin in its organization, methods, political philosophy, and social appeal to Nazi and fascist parties. There has always been a strain of Jewish fascism within the Zionist project, mirroring the strain of fascism in American society, and unfortunately for us, the Israelis and the Palestinian, these fascistic strains are ascendant. The left is no longer capable of overcoming the toxic ultranationalism that has evolved here. Zef Sternhill, a Holocaust survivor, and Israel's foremost authority on fascism, warned in 2018. The kind whose European strain almost wiped out a minority of the Jewish people. Sternhill added, we see not just a growing Israeli fascism, but racism akin to Nazism in its early stages. The decision to obliterate Gaza has long been the dream of far-right Zionists, heirs of Kahana's movement. Jewish identity and Jewish nationalism are the Zionist version of the Nazis' blood and soil. Jewish supremacy is sanctified by God, as is the slaughter of the Palestinians, who Netanyahu compares to the biblical Amalekites massacred by the Israelites. Euro-American settlers in the American colonies used the same biblical passage to justify the genocide against Native Americans. Enemies, usually Muslims, slated for extinction are subhuman, who embody evil. Violence and the threat of violence are the only forms of communication those outside the magical circle of Jewish nationalism supposedly understand. Messianic redemption will take place once the Palestinians are expelled. Jewish extremists call for the Al-Aqsa Mosque, the third holiest shrine for Muslims, built on the ruins of the Jewish Second Temple, which was destroyed in 70 CE by the Roman army, to be demolished. The mosque is to be replaced by a third Jewish temple, a move that would set the Muslim world alight. The West Bank, which the Zealots call Judea and Samaria, will be formally annexed by Israel, and Israel, governed by the religious laws imposed by the ultra-Orthodox Shas and United Judaism parties, will become a Jewish version of Iran. There are over 65 laws which discriminate directly or indirectly against Palestinian citizens of Israel and those living in the occupied territories. The campaign of indiscriminate killing of Palestinians in the West Bank, many by rogue Jewish militias who have been armed with over 10,000 automatic rifles since October 7, along with house and school demolitions and the seizure of remaining Palestinian land, is exploding. And Israel is at the same time turning on quote-unquote Jewish traitors within Israel and abroad who refuse to embrace the demented vision of the ruling Jewish fascists and who denounce the genocide. The familiar enemies of fascism, journalists, human rights advocates, intellectuals, artists, feminists, liberals, the left, are targeted. The judiciary, according to plans put forward by Netanyahu, will be neutered. Public debate will wither. Civil society, the rule of law, will cease to exist. And those branded as disloyal will be deported. Israel could have exchanged the hostages held by Hamas for the thousands of Palestinian hostages held in Israeli prisons, which is why the Israeli hostages were seized. And they could have done this on October 8th. And there is evidence that in the chaotic fighting that took place, once Hamas militants entered Israel, the Israeli military decided to target not only Hamas fighters, but the Israeli captives with them, killing perhaps hundreds of their own soldiers and civilians. Israel and its Western allies, James Baldwin saw, is headed towards, quote, the terrible probability that the dominant nations, struggling to hold on to what they have stolen from their captives and unable to look into their mirror, will precipitate a chaos throughout the world, which, if it does not bring life on this planet to an end, will bring about a racial war such as the world has never seen. The funding and arming of Israel by the United States and European nations as it carries out genocide has imploded the post-World War II international order. It no longer has credibility, and the West cannot lecture anyone now about democracy, human rights, or the supposed virtues of Western civilization. At the same time that Gaza induces vertigo, a feeling of chaos and emptiness, it becomes for countless powerless people the essential condition of political and ethical consciousness in the 21st century, just as the First World War was for a generation in the West, Pankaj Mishra writes. We must name and face our own darkness. We must repent. Our willful blindness and historical amnesia, our refusal to be accountable to the rule of law, our belief that we have a right to use industrial violence to exert our will marks, I fear, the start, not the end, of campaigns of mass slaughter by industrialized nations against the world's growing legions of the poor and the vulnerable. It is the curse of Cain, and it is a curse we must remove before the genocide in Gaza becomes not an anomaly, but the norm. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris, for that amazing address and for giving us the benefit of all your knowledge and understanding of why this is happening today. We might just have a seat and a bit of a chat. I think where we are now, Chris, everyone is wondering what's going to happen next, what's going to happen to those people. They've been pushed basically onto a sand dune with an invisible yellow line, and if anyone approaches the yellow line, they're shot. What is going to happen to those people, and what's going to happen to the West Bank? Because I know you've been watching that close.
Well, Israel's intent since the genocide began has been quite open and quite clear. When Anthony Blinken made his first trip to Israel after October 7th, he then went on to meet Sisi in Egypt, Abdullah in Jordan, and he had quotas of Palestinians that he wanted these countries to accept. This request was met with complete rejection, but from the beginning, the goal has been the complete eradication of Palestinians from Gaza. Israel, according to the Israeli press, has been in negotiations with countries like the Sudan, Somaliland, and Somalia about the relocation of Palestinian refugees. And what they are doing is to create conditions that are just so onerous, which is what, of course, mass starvation and famine does, that the moment they are able to open the door, Palestinians will leave. That is what remember, Israel, it physically occupies 53% still of Gaza, but it still, in essence, occupies all of Gaza. Its drones are in the sky, it controls the border, its troops are in the south. They just killed a Palestinian family of, I believe, 9 today. And then we have the rhetoric out of Jerusalem has been quite clear. Katz has talked about preparing the military to defeat and eradicate Hamas. Netanyahu has talked about resuming the war, preparing to resume the war. Whatever excuse they use, the whole notion that, and they knew this from the beginning, that those Israeli hostages who had died could be located easily. They knew this was impossible because most of them, almost probably all of them, were killed by Israeli bombs, and their captors were killed with them. And you have mountains and mountains of rubble. So number one, they don't have the equipment to dig through the rubble, and number two, they just don't know where they are. But Israel is aware of that. Israel knows Hamas is not going to essentially disband itself, but they don't care. I mean, the only question is how long they will resume the genocide. Trump has already given the green light for it. And so they won't give up on their demented project until they push the Palestinians out. There are only 2 ways to stop the genocide. 1, you pull the plug on the weapons, primarily from the United States, or 2, countries, Turkey, France, Spain, use their warships to break the naval blockade along the coast, and deliver humanitarian aid to the Palestinians and create a no-fly zone over Gaza, which isn't. I covered the Kurds in northern Iraq when Saddam was pushing them all up into the mountain passes, and that's precisely what they did. Iraqi forces had to withdraw below the 38th parallel, and there was a no-fly zone. It could easily be done. But I think that is, and certainly was what I attempted to do in my talk, the reason the genocide is not stopped is because these Western countries are fully on board with it. They're well aware from the beginning of what Israel intends to do, and they embrace it.
And why has the UN been so, totally unable to do anything to stop this? We recently saw an attempt to trigger this obligation to protect, and then that was scuttled because, bingo, that it's time for another ceasefire. So everyone wanted to give that ceasefire a chance. But essentially, the United Nations has been able to do absolutely nothing to stop this.
Well, there's no enforcement mechanism, number one. And countries like the United States and Israel have an utter disdain and disregard for the rule of law. So they just don't have the leverage by which they can force Israel to comply with the rule of law. And when we were today outside of BAE Systems, which, by the way, is one of the sponsors of your press club, I made the point that, you know, we are calling for the rule of law. I mean, many of us might like to think of ourselves as dangerous leftists, but we are in fact on the political scale conservatives. We demand the rule of law. That's what we are demanding. Under the rule of law,
Of course, the country that that flies in the face of the rule of law most is the United States. Yeah. And what is going to enable change in the US? We've got someone of the calibre of Mamdani at present, and he's managing to achieve an enormous amount of support with a minuscule amount of funds compared to what's being poured into his to shore up his rivals. What is it going to take to bring about real change in the US? Because essentially there's no difference really in terms of foreign policy between the two major parties.
well, first of all, the billionaire class has already said that if Mamdani wins, they'll crucify him. They will make his time in office absolutely untenable. That is always the tactic of retrograde capitalists. I covered Pinochet's Chile. And we have to remember that the Democratic Party sabotaged Bernie Sanders' campaign. And if you go back before that, I was Ralph Nader's speechwriter, worked with Ralph when he ran. Our enemy was the Democratic Party. We tried everything possible, did everything possible to block, excluding Nader from the debates, challenging voter lists. So the only mechanism we have now to wrest back our rapidly closing open society is militant union activity and civil disobedience by which we shut the machine down. And that is, I was in London a few months ago to do a fundraiser for my friend Roger Hallam, who founded Extinction Rebellion and Just Stop Oil, and they shut down the M25 motorway, and he was given a 5-year prison sentence, even though he wasn't even on the motorway because he helped organize it. And that shows you what they're scared of. I mean, the fact is, it has to be clear to all of us by now that our governments won't halt the genocide. And so, like the great militant unions of the past, we have to stop loading these weapons on ships.
It's not only the United States, of course. Why aren't the other powers in the world doing anything about this? Russia, because they were partly responsible for what's happened to the Palestinians historically. China carries a lot of weight today. Why aren't we seeing any intervention from those two powers?
There's quiet. I mean, so the landscape is shifting in the Middle East. Iran, of course, has a close alliance with both, has an alliance with Russia and China. After Israel's bombing of Qatar. Now, the United States has a huge airbase, the largest in the Middle East, in Qatar. They certainly would have seen all of those missiles coming into Qatar, and they did not tell the Qataris until the explosions already. And what this has done is kind of woken up Gulf countries, including Saudi Arabia, to the fact that the United States will do nothing to stay Israel's hand, that Israel is intent on creating, and has already created, intent to greater Israel. I mean, it controls Syrian territory, not just the Golan Heights, but all the way up to Damascus, southern Lebanon, Gaza, of course. And there is a shift now, at the very least, bringing in Chinese air defense systems. So I think I think especially with that bombing of Qatar, it's beginning to change the dynamics. And let's remember that the American empire, in case you hadn't noticed, is in deep decline. Ruled by our version of Caligula. And don't let these idiots turn your country into a vassal state, please.
Well, some would say it's too late. The north of Australia is becoming a base for US ships and planes, and we have this agreement, as you know, with AUKUS, and the next war is mooted to be with China. And Australia has been there for all of these military adventures that the United States has embarked on. You were talking before about civil disobedience and union action. I'm wondering if we can talk a little bit more about the sorts of things people can do and activists can do.
Well, I think that the activists have already changed the narrative. These courageous students who in the United States were our nation's conscience have been brutally suppressed. Campuses have been turned into academic gulags. Columbia University, where I've taught, is literally under police lockdown. You can't even get into the yard. Outside police forces have been integrated into campus security. Professors who have denounced what was done to these students and the draconian measures taken by the university, like Catherine Franke, this great law scholar at Columbia Law School for 25 years, have been pushed out. So this Zionist project and its supporters, they no longer have any answer. It's just naked forms of coercion. But let's be clear that none of this is about anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism is a trope to shut down dissidents in the left. Because the real anti-Semites come from the right. And I know because I spent 2 years writing a book about the Christian right called American Fascists, the Christian Right and the War on America. And I'm a divinity school graduate. I mean, I come out of a strong Christian tradition. My father was a Presbyterian minister. My mother graduated from seminary and was a professor. But all of that gave me the tools to see these people for who they are. We are, living in a moment. It's a longer discussion, although I've written about it, with the global policies of neoliberalism and deindustrialization and everything else, that has just radically deformed our countries. And what you're seeing is a response, whether it's in Germany, whether it's in France, whether it's in Hungary, whether it's in the United States, that is the consequence of a bankrupt liberalism.
What about the role of the media? How has it reinforced the position of the various groups that are prosecuting that have brought us to where we are today. Because both of us have been members of the mainstream media. I can tell you that in Australia, for example, with respect to Palestinians, the way the media have approached the Palestinian-Israeli issue is that they send their journalists backwards and forwards to Israel. The doors to the managing director's office and the chairman's office are wide open to all these Zionist groups that are all chairmen and CEOs and directors with letterheads and business cards. And the Palestinians don't have that. So those doors have been firmly shut, really. So the media have colluded in preparing the public for this, and preparing and laying the groundwork for politicians to be able to do this. And tell me a bit about why you left the mainstream media.
It was two phases. So I was so sick of the New York Times coverage of Palestine. The way they neuter your reporting two ways. One, so you're at war with not only Israeli politicians and military spokespeople who lie like they breathe, but you're also at war with your own Washington bureau, whose all their reporting, they're just stenographers for the powerful. It's all about access. And big, it's probably the same for you, but big media organizations like the New York Times really prize access, even though, of course, what you're fed, as I.F. Stone points out, is usually untrue. So you have your Washington bureau that is reporting things that are diametrically opposed or attempting to counter what you're reporting on the ground. And then the other way they would neuter stories is that even though I was in Jabalia when it was bombed and counted the bodies, every other paragraph, and I was quoting eyewitnesses, would be an IDF spokesperson. So by the time you got to the end of the story, you could believe whatever you wanted to believe, which was the point. So I took my vacation time and I went to live in Hana Yunus for 10 days and wrote a piece called A Gaza Diary with Joe Sacco, who I am currently doing a book with. We just came back from Egypt, where we interviewed 29 families from Gaza, and we're writing, it's all reported, we're writing about the genocide through their experiences and through their eyes. And Joe will draw out. We did a book together called Days of Destruction, Days of Revolt, written out of porous pockets of the United States, and 50 pages of that were his panels and drawings. We're doing the same project together. So we did that piece. Actually, I went to Edward Said and said, okay, I'm gonna do this piece. I'm not gonna interview any Fatah officials. I'm just gonna interview Palestinians in a refugee camp and live with them for 10 days and write about their lives, but I've gotta find someone who will publish it. He called the publisher of Harper's and got them to do it, although when it came out, the Zionists went berserk. And so did my employer, the New York Times, who told me that I would never cover the Middle East again. And then when the Iraq War started, I spent a lot of time in Iraq. I understood, number one, I'd been in the first Gulf War. I'd entered Kuwait with the Marine Corps, and then I'd been in Basra with the Shiites, rebels, until I was taken prisoner by the Iraqi Republican Guard. I got to be embedded in the Iraqi Republican Guard for 8 days. I wouldn't recommend it. So I certainly understood that because I was there for the UN inspection teams, that Saddam did have chemical stockpiles, but they were all destroyed after the war. And also Iraq broke down. I mean, it couldn't get any spare parts. Saddam was, I'm not making this up, living in one of his palaces writing romance novels. He was. I mean, he wasn't a threat anymore to his neighbors, certainly not to us. And I also, understanding Arab nationalism, Baathism, knew the folly of saying that we would be greeted as liberators and that the oil would pay for the reconstruction and that democracy, which is frankly the last thing the United States wanted to implant, would take over and emanate outwards across the Middle East. And of course, what they really wanted was to bring down the Ayatollahs in Iran. I mean, this was magical thinking. And all of us who covered the Middle East understood this. There's no dispute about it. It was just a career killer to say it. But I think for me it was personal in the sense that I understood that people I cared about, because of this, what ended up being a 20-year project, a 20-year fiasco, which destroyed Iraq, would take the lives of people I cared about, friends of mine. And same with Gaza. And that, you know, I would go back one day, and you know, we may have failed, but I at least wanted to say I tried. I was booed off. I was on all sorts of national shows denouncing the war, and then I was on a commencement stage where I denounced the war, and the audience of 1,000 people got up and began to sing "God Bless America" to turn me out, and cut my mic, and then the right-wing trash Murdoch people. I don't know about Australia, produced some of the greatest journalists of our era, Julian Assange, John Pilger, and frankly, some of the worst.
Perhaps one final question, since you raised Julian Assange. So Julian was prosecuted for revealing what the United States did not want revealed. Yeah. Today, it's all happening out in the open. That is extraordinary that we've come that far from 2011 to 2025, and there's been such a massive change for what is tolerated. So his prosecution was in vain. It's all out in the open now. What does that, what does that foretell for the future?
Well, all of the institutions now speak as an American tasked with defending democratic civil rights, have collapsed. This preceded Trump. I mean, Trump is the symptom, he's not the disease. And I spent 20 years writing about it in book after book. Death of the liberal class, empire of illusion, the end of spectacle, the triumph of the end of literacy and the triumph of spectacle, which, interestingly enough, begins at a World Wrestling Federation match. I had no idea we were going to get a president that came out of professional wrestling. America, the farewell tour, Days of Destruction, Days of Revolt, I mean, all of it. And I think like a few other writers, Barbara Ehrenreich, Chalmers Johnson, we all kept saying you can't distort a society like this, and I drew on my own experience covering the war in Yugoslavia, and you are eventually going to vomit up the same kinds of figures that I covered in Yugoslavia, Radovan Karadzic, Slobodan Milosevic, Franjo Tudjman, etc. And so the problem is the decay precedes Trump. The Democratic Party is a corpse. It doesn't even function as a political party. If a political party is driven by the demands of its base, it doesn't function as a political party. They didn't even get to vote for the last presidential nominee, Kamala Harris, who ran a vapid, issueless, celebrity-driven campaign that stood for nothing. I mean, 77% of registered Democrats want to end arms shipments to Israel. And the Democratic Party has capitulated, has failed in any meaningful way to halt Trump's rapid consolidation of our police state and authoritarian control, along with the media, along with the universities. Labor is a spent force in the United States, only 11% are organized. 6% of those are public workers who don't even have the right to strike. The strike is the only real weapon we have, which is why they took it away from us. So as in the United States, I don't see how we're going to halt it. I mean, the thing that astonishes me is how fast it's happening. And it's very frightening. We have so you had the trope of anti-Semitism used to shut down the left and take over the universities. And look, I went to Harvard, I've taught at Princeton, I've taught at Columbia. The idea that these universities are incubators of anti-Semitism is ridiculous.
Yeah.
Not that anti-Semitism doesn't exist, it does. But the idea that these institutions foster it. Yet they all got down on their knees.
Yeah.
And they gave credibility to this false narrative that, of course, is now being used to essentially shut down free speech. They have shut down free speech. The press the decay in the press, again, preceded Trump. But what you're watching now, it's all billionaires. I mean, Bezos owns the Washington Post. Larry Ellison bought up CBS, and it looks like he's about to buy up CNN and HBO and TikTok. And they hate TikTok because it was a mechanism that skirted the legacy media and allowed people to actually see the genocide. But I can tell you that once Larry Ellison gets his hands on it, this is a guy who's contributed millions of dollars to the IDF and has just appointed this arch-Zionist Barry Weiss to run the news division of CBS. It's over. So the billionaire class, which is wedded with the Zionist lobby for, I think, some of the reasons I touched upon, is rapidly closing the space. And I get hit every time I do something on the genocide on the YouTube channel, and some of my YouTubes, when I did a month ago, has 2.4 million views. They demonetize it. They demonetize it, they throw in algorithms, it's clear. I mean, like on X, that's completely obvious because it gets stuck at 276,000. So when you get new subscribers, it magically goes back 276,000, which is not insignificant, but it's been stuck there for so long, it's kind of become a joke. So yeah, and you know who actually foresaw this was Julian. If you go back and read his book, Cypherpunks, he talks about the power of the internet initially to create spaces for people to challenge the dominant narrative and challenge authority, but ultimately, and he's right, of course, it will become one of the most effective mechanisms of control because it's been seized by the most retrograde forces. And let's be clear, YouTube, X, all these people are now completely wedded to the security and surveillance apparatus. They hire people from it. I did an interview with Roger Waters from Pink Floyd, which was immediately demonetized because it's Roger Waters. It's just who's running these algorithms? Well, we know, they come out of the Israeli military. So yeah, the situation is really grim. I hope you're not I don't think you are where we are, but we're in a really bad place. And the fact that Trump is essentially consolidating power as a dictator, he just runs roughshod over every constitutional right because he has an obsequious Republican Party in control of Congress and a bunch of right-wing lunatics on the Supreme Court. There's just no, and even though we have courageous judges who are issuing rulings against the Trump administration, the Department of Justice is run by an idiot, Pam Bondi. Look at these people. It's kind of they're buffoons, except they're buffoons who can kill you. Go back and look at the Nazi Party. they were also buffoons, but that doesn't mean they weren't incredibly dangerous. I mean, Trump is just out of control. Every speech that he gives, which is always the same, actually, and the narcissism and the cabinet meetings. I mean, I feel like I lived in Latin America for 6 years. There's that great novel by the Guatemala Studios, El Presidente. It's kind of, that's where we are. You know, it's who can lick El Presidente's shoes, you know, with more passion and alacrity. I mean, if you get a chance, just next time he has a cabinet meeting, pretty grim, just watch it. It's, that's where we are. But unfortunately, you know, we also have this incredibly powerful military that can do a lot. I mean, he's bombing boats off of Venezuela.
Yeah.
The whole thing is nuts. And so, yeah, I don't know. I may have to move to Australia. I don't know.
I know Chris is going to thank you in a moment, but I just wanted to say thank you for making the effort to come all the way here. Focusing on the Palestinian people. It's so important to all of us around the world who are just really shattered at where this has come to, and perhaps really it's forced us, all of us, larger numbers of people than in the past, to see how bad things have you know, just how bad things are. And perhaps we really have to get to the edge in order to be able to turn things around. Please thank